Hi everybody, I'm Sean Ryan. I'm running for District 6 City Council. First, before I go, I'd like to thank my mom and my brother and Kelsey and Trina and David and Laura for coming and supporting me, even if you don't agree with me on everything. I grew up in Jamaica Plain. I actually grew up right down the street here on Lamartine Street. So I was born in 1980. I began in the public schools in 1984. I went to the Trotter School in Roxbury on Humboldt Ave. So that was from kindergarten to grade 3. Then for grades 4 and 5, I went to the James W. Hennigan School in Jamaica Plain. And then I went to the Martin Luther King School for 1 year. That's in Dorchester. And then I was fortunate enough to go to Boston Latin School. I graduated from Boston Latin School and I went to Harvard, where I majored in music. Shortly after that, I took a few years off. I saved up money before I went to grad school, and I got a master's degree in orchestral conducting. During my time in school in Cleveland, I became much more interested in politics, and I decided that I would have to put music on the side for a while. I came back to Boston, and now I've had a political career for just over 2 years. So, I'm running for District 6 City Council. I have a very simple message, and I have 3 issues that I'd like to draw everyone's attention to in this race. Those issues are schools, services, and safety. And schools, I think why I have schools on the list should be self-explanatory to anybody who has lived in Boston. By services, I'm just trying to draw people's attention to the economic realities that we're facing and what we're going to have to do to continue to provide the most urgent services for people who need them. And then for safety, also self-explanatory if you live in JP, or if you live in Roxbury, or if you live in Mattapan, or if you live in Dorchester, we have some problems with violence in our city. I think I have a very good understanding of each of these problems. I understand the schools because I was in the schools for 14 years. I was bused. Busing is an issue that comes up with regard to the schools. I volunteered in the schools when I was in college. I volunteer at a private school down the street for low-income kids. And this past year I was teaching in the Boston Public Schools. I'm a member of the Boston Teachers Union. Although I don't agree with the union leadership on necessarily every issue, the same way I don't agree with the Democratic Party leadership, my party's leadership on every issue. Services, I have a very good understanding of economics, so I understand the economic situation we're going through. It's a complicated one. I probably won't have time to discuss it in depth tonight, but I assure you I understand the realities that we're facing. And with regard to safety, I grew up in JP. I understand what it's like to grow up in a neighborhood where there is crime. I was fortunate enough never to have any violence used on me, but there were several times where we came down the stairs and there was somebody in our front hall, stealing our stuff. So one of those times my father ran after this guy in his underwear, and we've seen it. We know what's going on. I'm more focused on the violent crime, and especially the violent crime that is related not just to drug use, but to drug laws and drug enforcement policy. Because I believe that when government institutes a law or a policy and it fails, the first thing we have to do, before we decide if we're going to put anything in its place, we have to stop doing the failed government policy. That's my 2-minute time limit, I suppose, so I guess the floor is open.
All right, so we'll start with some questions based on your questionnaire. First one is on the topic of affordable housing.
Yes.
When you answered the question, you addressed the issue of affordable housing more broadly, but you didn't directly answer the question. So folks can tell we like to pin people down here. So to be clear, do you or do you not support the Forest Hills Initiative's goals of having 50% affordable housing on publicly owned land and 30% on privately owned land?
I believe that government should not be writing rules about the use for land. I believe that if government owns land, if it's publicly owned, then of course, yes, the government is going to have to decide how it's being used. If that's going to be the reality, then I think we should try and find an estimate as to exactly what the market would tell you that usage is supposed to be. But I would prefer to just sell off the government land and then let the free market determine what those uses are. I do think that there is a cry for affordable housing, and we can see it because prices are high. So if we look at the price, we have to ask ourselves, how did the price get to be that way? Is it supply? Is it demand? It has to be one or the other. I happen to think that simply demand is outstripping supply, and there are lots of things that government is doing to interfere with the market's ability to meet that demand. And I would prefer to focus on the root causes of a problem of not enough affordable housing, rather than, writing laws that force us to do things a certain way.
Second question, one of the bigger issues in the city council and mayoral races last year was the role of the BRA, and whether or not any reforms were needed. In your questionnaire you said some institutions like the BRA should be reformed or closed. I'd love to see you elaborate a little bit on what reforms you're looking for, or if it should be closed.
Well, the BRA is an example of a government agency that is no longer doing the purpose for which it was created. So we have to ask ourselves, if it's not doing what it was intended to do, why is it still here, and what is it doing? So I would like to see the BRA reformed, if we keep it at all, because I think that we don't need central planners downtown planning out development in our town. I think what we do need is simple, clearly worded, local zoning regulations that are approved by people in very small areas, possibly down to the precinct level. We will then see competition between different precincts. Some precincts may say, we want to have 9-story apartment buildings like Brookline has on our thoroughfares, because that will bring the price of housing in our neighborhood down, and then more people will want to live there and do business there, and businesses will benefit. So I think it's all about localizing it, but then actually writing rules within which developers can work. Because at this point, you cannot develop in this town without breaking a rule, so that means you have to go to the city, and then the city has a say as to whether or not you're going to get the right to develop or not. And what that means is, that may be selectively enforce some of these rules depending on your relationship with people in government. So I'd rather see the market controlling development rather than people downtown, on the 9th floor of City Hall.
Moving on to the question of charter reform. In your answer on charter reform, you suggested we needed home rule petition reform, which there are many who might agree with you, but that's actually a matter for the state legislature, not so much the city council. Are there other suggestions you might have, reforms you'd like to see to give the city council more power, particularly relative to the mayor and some that proposed?
Well, it's not a particularly important issue to me, to be quite frank. I don't have anything against a committee to examine the city charter, but I think that the issues of the schools, which is the most important one, and then the issues of public safety, which is the second one, and then the issue of how we're going to continue providing services when we have less money, those are important issues. They don't necessarily have to do with charter reform or home rule petitions. I just think that Boston needs to be more independent, because we are dependent on the state government for a lot of things, specifically aid, and we're not going to be getting as much state aid, so we need to figure out what we're going to do in lieu of all this aid that we were using and receiving before. So I do think in general Boston should be more independent, but I don't think that this particular part of the charter is what's preventing us from solving some of the more important issues.
Do you feel as though if you were to become a city councilor under the current charter, you would have the power you need to accomplish the goals you've been talking about?
I certainly do.
All right, so we move on to education, topic you said you wanted to talk about. A recent study ranked Boston schools as the 4th most segregated in the country, particularly isolating Black and Latino schools and low-performing schools, students, and low-performing schools. What, if anything, do you think needs to be done to change the situation?
Well, first of all, we should admit that busing, the busing that was already instituted in order to desegregate the schools, has failed. Before we talk about the reality now, let's talk about how we got here. I mean, I talk about busing a lot because it's a hot topic issue. People have experienced this. Elderly folks remember when busing was forced upon people, and people these days don't remember that it was called forced busing. This is what many people call it. And regardless of whether you think it was necessary, or regardless of whether you think it was efficacious, it was forced. People didn't want this. And it's not just the people in Southie who didn't want it. People in Roxbury didn't want it either. So I think there's a limit to the amount of good that government can do through force, especially when it regards, how we're getting along with each other and where you want to live and who you want to associate with, that kind of thing. So I think we need a much more, a much higher level of discussion about the schools issue than we generally get from our politicians in this town. But yes, I read that article in the Globe with great interest because I said, well, I guess the debate must be over. Busing failed. The schools are still segregated. So now they're not just segregated by race, they're segregated by class as well. Because now we have middle and working class people of all races who are abstaining. They're just leaving the schools. They don't want what the city is providing, and so they go elsewhere, which is what everybody always does. I mean, if you run a business, you know this, because if you don't provide a product that people want, they leave. So the only people who are left now are the lucky few who are able, through the lottery process, to get into a school that is working, and those people who do not have the means to abstain, to go elsewhere. So that's the problem. And let's ask ourselves, why is it, and are there things that we can do to invite middle and working class people back into the system, and then maybe we'll see a lot more community involvement in our schools than we're seeing right now. So I think basically with the schools we have to discuss the lottery system. This is everybody's first impression of the schools. If you're a young family, if you have a kid who's 1 or 2, and I talk to these young families every single day, they're already thinking about the schools. And they are concerned. They are intimidated, they are alienated by the lottery process. They don't want to gamble with their kids' education. They want to be able to plan ahead now. They want to know who their kid's going to be going to school with. Not only that, but who the parents that they will be working with are going to be. They want to be able to make plans. I think we should allow them to do this by giving people a greater say, a greater amount of choice in where their kids go to school. The busing thing, we've discussed. We spend $80 million on it each year. It's a tenth of the entire school budget, and it doesn't seem to be serving the purpose for which it was intended, and therefore I think we should consider allocating that money elsewhere, possibly directing to classrooms to do things like arts, music, after-school programs. I had all of these things when I was at the William Monroe Charter School in Roxbury in 1984. We don't have them now. And then the third thing is we have to decide about charter schools, because this has been an issue, and it's like a tug of war between various interest groups, and yet nobody has said charter schools are bad. Because if charter schools are bad, we just shouldn't have them, right? If we've decided that there's nothing wrong with the idea, the concept of charter schools, then why are we not allowing everybody who wants that public service? And charter schools are public schools because they are funded by the government, i.e. the taxpayer. It's a public service. You have to ask yourself, would it be fair, would it even be legal for the city to deny a public service like a stoplight or a stop sign? If you had to go to a lottery and say, we'd like a stop sign on our street, and then 8,000 people who want them don't get them. It's arbitrary. And that's what people don't like about the system. It's arbitrary, people don't have control, they don't have influence. The school system is not accountable to parents. So I have a few ideas about how we can change that. I'm not pro or con charter school, but I just think we should settle this issue once and for all, so we're not battling it out in the state legislature for years, while 8,000 people who want to go to a charter school are waiting. So I talk about these 3 issues with parents all over the district in JP and West Roxbury. I've noticed that there is an overwhelming consensus about what's going wrong. We don't all agree on how we can make it better, but there are certain things that I think we can agree on. And we need somebody in the council who's going to stand up for this issue. Not get elected and then hold a hearing every once in a while. We need somebody who's going to hold hearings every month until we work this issue out.